Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody, to Nightlight. Thanks so much for joining us and for sharing your time with us. We know how precious that is, and we totally appreciate the fact that you follow us, that you listen to us, that you get some knowledge and some enlightenment from what some of the guests are saying, and that you pass it on, because that's the point of the show, to share the wisdom. And what applies to you, pick up, embrace, and utilize. What doesn't, move on, because it's everything is not for everybody. We want to thank Ken Quiethawk for his amazing intro. We totally appreciate he and his wife. You can find them at nativestorytellers.com. And if you've never experienced the Native Storytellers, it's an adventure that you should try. It's a way of preserving history, cosmology, wisdom, and generations of insight and discovery through stories. And it's been passed generation to generation to generation. And it probably is far more accurate than what our textbooks today show. So please check it out. It's nativestorytellers.com. You won't be disappointed. Tonight, I really am so excited. Tonight, we welcome Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince, who share their new book with all of us, When God Had a Wife. It's an amazing book. It fills a lot of blank spaces for those of us who are looking for more answers and filling in the blanks to the beginning of the major religions before they became mainstream, and a lot of the history before the history books even had information to give us. It's the kind of book you have to read 3 or 4 times, because every time you read it, you find something new. And though I've only read it once, I have a promise to myself to go back and start charting and taking even better notes than I took the first time. They address how Judaism originally had more than one much-loved goddess, and how they very nearly lost her, but not quite, and how she resurfaced in early Christianity in a rather unlikely form and is still with us today, gratefully. Lynn Picknett and Clive Prince have worked together on nonfiction books about religious and historical mysteries for over 25 years. Their most influential book so far is the Templar Revelation that they wrote in 1997 and then revised in 2007, which was a major inspiration for the Vinci Code, and they were even given cameos in the music. So really famous people here. A major theme of their own work has always been the suppression but persistence of the sacred feminine, and how they present their most explosive evidence for the lost goddess in both Judaism and Christianity in their latest book, When God Had a Wife, The Fall and Rise of the Sacred Feminine in the Judeo-Christian Tradition. You can find them at www.picknettprince.com. That's PicknettPrince.com. Check out all of their books, because these two individuals do research that is so profound, it's unbelievable. I stopped fact-checking them because, the information they have gathered is so well established and it's right there. You can see the proof for it. So they don't take you on flights of fancy. They give you hard evidence, and you either swallow it or not, depending on where you are. And you can always go back and reread it to get extra tidbits and stuff like that when you move into different levels of your own evolution. So, Lynn and Clive, thank you so much for joining me tonight. I so appreciate your work and your efforts, and you blow me away with especially this latest book. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Barbara. It's amazing being on the show.
Thank you for inviting us. And it sounds like we've got a lot to live up to.
It does actually.
Well, I'm not at all. I'm familiar with someone with a photographic memory, and I know what happens when you keep fact checking them. You just waste your time. But I did. It was kind of like, let me just see about that, and it was fascinating to. I think for me, the most exciting part of it is we all know the basic history that the Bible covers roughly, but you go before the Bible. And then as you move forward, what fascinated me the most was I know people whom I love dearly who swear that this was inspired writing and that once God was finished, he was never going to write again. And you go back and you say, well, they had to revise it here and they had to do a little technical work on it there. And so, in essence, the Bible is a work in process. It's not finished yet.
Yeah, but exactly. We always get this impression that the books in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, which tell that whole story from the creation, right through to just before the beginning of the Christian era, kind of Old Testament is sort of setting the scene for Jesus in the Christian Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, it obviously stands alone, but you get that feeling that as it tells that story, say from Moses onwards, that you're kind of reading it as it happened. But of course, like any history book, it was put together at a particular point in time. Although it may have drawn on sources that go back a long way, at some point, somebody or rather a group of people sat down and said, let's put all this together into the kind of the fixed canon of books. And this happened surprisingly late. This happened around about sort of 450 BC. And at that point, they take the stories, the old stories, and they change them, revise them, rewrite them in the light of where they are in history at that point in time. So they essentially rewrite the history. Some things that happened in the past aren't important to them anymore. Other things, they have to put a different spin on it. So the story in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, really does need to be looked at as any work of historical writing.
Yeah, sort of biblical Stalinists, rewriting history to suit the current regime.
Yeah.
Well, let's take it all the way back to the very beginning, and this is a part of history that most people don't go to, but the Creator's name was not God or Yahweh; it was El.
In the very beginning, in Genesis, obviously the first book of the Hebrew Bible, God is El. Mm-hmm. And there comes a point in the story where he changes his name. And the point of when that happens is when Moses has his experience with the burning bush. And this is the point where God becomes Yahweh. And thereafter, throughout the Bible, throughout the books of the Hebrew Bible, he's referred to almost exclusively as Yahweh, occasionally as El. But it's a very sudden change. And other things happen as well. The names, people's own personal names, which obviously has the God part in them. Before that point, there were no that there were none with Yahweh as part of their name. They're all El. Afterwards, there's lots of Yahweh names. So something actually really did happen historically at that point. There was a change in God's name, but the evidence is it wasn't so much that God changed its name, is that it was actually a different God.
Yeah. So there's more than one God at the beginning.
Well, yeah, there were lots of them, and they all weren't men.
Well, yes, and that is, as we know, Barbara, the important point. Yes, I mean, there's what we think is rather sweet. I mean, there's archaeological evidence, in the last few years, turning up figurines and inscriptions on bits of pottery to Yahweh and his Asherah, or El and Elat. Basically God and his female consort. And it was an incredibly common, much loved part of the religion. And it was part of the official religion as well for many, many years. So yes, so we're talking about long, long ago, and it was not this rigid patriarchal religion as we might think of today.
The really crucial point is when I referred to that putting together of the official history, so about 450 BC, up until that point, and this is like an amazing fact, but it is a fact that is actually accepted by all academics and all scholars of the period, and you can actually reconstruct it from the Bible itself. But up until that point, the Israelites, the Hebrews, were not monotheists, despite what we've always been told, in school, in Sunday school, in church, in the synagogue. We think of it as the Bible is the story of a monotheistic religion, but actually it wasn't. And the strange thing is that once you know that and you read the Hebrew Bible, the books of the Hebrew Bible don't even pretend otherwise. It does talk about other gods.
It's just that they had decided to follow and worship one of those gods, but they acknowledged the existence of others, many others.
Well, when you get right down to it, the thought of, especially in a society where women had very much the same power, so to speak. I mean, they went through a period of time where, and especially in Egypt, where women, were equals, and then suddenly, not so. But when you look at the aspect of God, as it is portrayed so often in so many places, all powerful, thundering, dictatorial almost, and yet, frankly, as a woman, I would pray to Mother Earth or Mother Nature. I don't want somebody with lightning bolts talking for me. I want somebody that knows what it's like to go through birth. So
exactly. You want another woman, but a woman plus. So a woman with extra power of godhood.
Mm-hmm. And I love the way you said that women, the goddesses were, and it's not the only term I can come up with is manipulate, but they were so subtle in getting their way that the male god didn't know that they were actually getting their way. Which
says a lot about the male god, though, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that that leapt out for us doing this research is this whole wisdom tradition, female wisdom tradition, which was among the ancient Israelites going back to a wisdom goddess, going back to Asherah, because Asherah was a goddess that was also worshipped by the Canaanites as well, and we actually know quite a bit more about how the Canaanites saw her, and we often have to assume that's how the Israelites saw her as well. But certainly in the Canaanite legends, she does have that particular form of, like you said, kind of manipulative. It is the word, but it's not looked at in a negative way. Mm-hmm. That whereas the god can just decree something, make a decision, the goddess has to kind of work around him and work through subtlety and suggestion and manipulation. This seems to have given rise to a whole tradition that is actually again there in the Hebrew Bible of wise women. There are wise women that pop up now and again in the Bible story, normally in the context that they are that they get a male ruler, even including King David himself, to change his mind. This seems to be their function. Now they pop up and they just appear like stories that are thrown in, but when you begin to actually piece all these different women together who act in the same way, who have the same title, there was this title, so it's just gone straight out of my head.
And mine.
A Mother in Israel, that's it, sorry. Yeah, they had this title, A Mother in Israel, which is what's applied to them. And for centuries, people have just thought, oh, it's just a phrase, it's just something nice to say about them. But it's actually very clear when you put it all together that this was actually a title that was a female counselor to the male rulers, even in matters of warfare. It's actually, and it's a strong tradition really up until the time of King David, and then it suddenly disappears. But for all that time, there was this wisdom tradition going back to a wisdom goddess.
What I particularly like, I mean, we don't know how old these women, mothers in Israel, were. They might have been any age, every age. But I do rather like the implication that there was a role for older women.
Oh, yeah. But you know what? It makes perfect sense in society as a whole for there to be a male-female, a positive-negative, I mean, a balance.
Yeah.
And when you take the softness and when you take the logic and the reason and the wisdom of the woman away, you have some guy going out there, hacking away and gaining power and then not knowing what to do with it. And look at the Oracle of Delphi. They, as I understand it, they were all women. So
yeah. But I mean, we ought to acknowledge, on the other hand, because it's something we talk quite a lot about in the book, is that you could have war goddesses too, who were like pretty scary. And again, there was another one that was part of the worship of the Israelites, a very fiery goddess called
very
Anat.
Scary. Yeah, very scary goddess Anat. You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of her on a dark night.
Well, what I found also interesting was as you went through time, when countries were taken over, quite often, the elite were taken and put someplace else, and yet the common folk were left where they were, so that they didn't have to suddenly change their religion to stay alive and maintain their property. They just kept going with their goddesses and their gods, and the elite were, going between one belief system and another, depending upon who had conquered their property.
Yeah, and it's another important bit of context, really, to look at when we read the Hebrew Bible, is to understand that the story it's telling is about the religion of the elite, of the rulers, of the kings, of the priesthood at the temple, in Jerusalem, in the capital city. So the story is really told from their perspective, and they weren't really that concerned about what the peasants out in the fields, what they believed, what they worshipped, and but because it is the story of the elite, it does give us a false impression of certain parts of the history. For example, after Jerusalem was captured by the Babylonians, we know about the Judahites, the Jews from Jerusalem being sent into the captivity in Babylon, into exile, and the impression you get is that that's the whole lot. The whole population was cleared out and sent there. But no, it's the elite. They reckon, historians who worked on this reckon about 25% of the population was sent into exile. 75% stayed where they were and carried on working the land and believing what they'd always believed. And it's when the elite came back from exile, their beliefs had changed while they were away. That's actually the point. It's actually slightly afterwards, a few generations on, but that's the point where they do this wholesale rewriting of the religion, the codifying of the religion, which entails them rewriting the history to make it to conform to their ideas.
It's a sort of shameless retrospective, really.
Well, they do say that history belongs to the victor, and over time, I mean, there was so much backing and forthing, and I think what most people don't understand too is that the story of the creation of all of Judaism and Christianity was a combination of so many different societies, Egypt included, and Egypt was very important in it all.
Absolutely, it ties a lot back to Egypt. One of the most controversial areas amongst scholars is the exact relationship between the Israelite religion and the Egyptian religion. As we piece it together in the book, we think there was a great influence of the Egyptian religion on the religion of Moses. The evidence is that Moses himself was an Egyptian. The story of him, being a Hebrew who was set adrift and then brought up in among the royal family of Egypt, was just a made-up story to hide the facts. Well, to explain the fact that although he was the leader of this people, he has an Egyptian name.
Yeah. Moses was, it's like Tutmos, which means, beloved of the god Thoth. Mose or Moses was a suffix you stuck at the end of a name to mean beloved of a certain god. And in fact, there's obviously a bit missing with his name. We'd love to know, wouldn't we, which god he was beloved of, but we don't get that.
And also, his sister Miriam, the first described as a prophetess, the first prophetess or prophet mentioned in the story, Moses' sister, her name comes from an Egyptian word as well. So the evidence is that the leadership of that group, and certainly the priesthood, because the others in the priesthood had Egyptian names, it's recognized now, that they were Egyptian. And they were the ones that led people into the Promised Land and then became the Israelites. But there was a strong Egyptian influence.
Well, so this story, those who wrote this story, I mean, as far as the Bible goes, it's very confusing because you think of one thing and then the facts don't hold out to support it, and so you're left with, well, what really did happen? And so as time goes on, do they go back and revise? When did they stop revising it? Because I know they kept putting different parts of it in for generations.
Oh, I mean, certain parts of it were changed, well into kind of the Christian period. I mean, there was continual editing of it. And just to pick, one example, a very telling example, is that the earliest actual manuscripts of certain books of the Bible are actually found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they have certain books that we're familiar with, and most of them are exactly the same as they've always been in both Christian and Jewish tradition, but certain words are changed. And for example, one word that is used of the group of celestial beings around God in the most recent interpretation is translated as angels. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, the word used is gods. So even since the Dead Sea Scrolls were written, which were sort of late BC, early AD, the word, someone's gone through and basically changed the word gods to angels.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's amazing how things have transcended through time, just with different names, and it boggles the mind. Like we had spoken of earlier, they keep changing names to fit the time and the perception of those within that reality, and what would be applicable for them and what would be acceptable to them. So actually, it's not as cut and dried as rabbis and priests and ministers are led to teach us. I mean, it's frankly, I think it's a more realistic and exciting story when you go back and you get all the facts.
Well, this is where we're coming from, actually, Barbara, as you know, in this book. We're trying to build a bridge between, if you like, the academics providing the facts and the mind-body-spirit community, because often there is this great distrust on either side. And really here, people know instinctively that there must have been a goddess. There must have been a goddess way back. But you can find out her name, where she was worshipped, when she was worshipped, by looking at the hard facts. So, yes, and of course, one of the ways that, as you point out, one of the manifestations of scrambling the facts is actually, sadly, what we're taught in synagogues and churches and at Sunday school, because obviously they have to pare it down and teach it very simplistically, but basically in doing that, they're losing a lot of the facts. And if you set yourself the task of being a sort of historical detective, which is kind of what we do, and then you go back and you just sort of pull back the various onion skins that have accrued, the layers of onion that have accrued over the years of this story, get back at the tiny little bit in the middle that's worth having. And basically, what you're doing is being very brave, and you're taking on, if you like, the whole of your religion, because you're saying, well, what the story you tell me is great, but I want to know the truth. I want to go back to the facts. And we feel we're helping people do that. We're providing, notes and references so that you can, as you have, double check stuff for yourself. And it's just a really exciting journey, because that's exactly what it is.
Well, yeah, and it gives one a better foundation to stretch from, because especially today, people are stretching beyond what the facts are going into a more deeper spiritual understanding of things. And if you have the foundation that you can move forward from, it gives you a better grasp of where you are going spiritually. Frankly, I think your book clears up so many questions people have, and it just, I mean, for instance, that in many of the temples, and there was not only they raised stones to designate Yahweh or El, but there was also a tree planted that was its partner that was a commemoration to Asherah. I mean, very early on, they understood there had to be a balance between the feminine and the masculine. And
absolutely. But for centuries, millennia, really, people have read the references to Asherim, plural Asherahs, and thought that they were just trees. That's all they were. That they didn't have, didn't know exactly what they stood for. But nevertheless, there's some kind of tree thing going on here. But who cares? But actually, now one realizes that the Asherim were actually, as you say, trees planted next to the representation of El or Yahweh. That actually they referenced the goddess Asherah. So you have, the stone for Yahweh and the tree for Asherah, and they, and there it is in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, over and over and over again, telling you that they were worshipped together.
And even more remarkably, and again, it's in the Hebrew Bible, is that Asherah was worshipped alongside Yahweh in the Temple of Jerusalem, in Solomon's temple. It's interesting that quite often during this rewriting of the story that happened when they kind of made the religion monotheistic, that the facts they give in the narrative are actually quite at odds with the message they say that they're trying to give. So, for example, when you go through the Bible and it tells the story of what happened in Solomon's temple, the impression they give is that was dedicated solely to the worship of Yahweh, but occasionally you had a kind of heretical or king would be kind of corrupted into the worship of this Asherah figure, and occasionally put up an image to her, a tree or something, actually within the temple, and then a prophet would come along and that image would be cleared out. So the impression they're trying to give is that having the Asherah symbol in the temple was something that happened now and again when things went wrong. But you actually go through and count up the years and the reigns of the kings they're telling you about, and it tells you it's the other way round, that most of the time the Asherah was worshipped in the temple alongside Yahweh, and very occasionally, it actually add up the years, it's about sort of 70% of the time Asherah was present in the temple, and the other 30% was when a king under the influence of an extreme prophet or another would have the thing removed, but then his successor as king would just put it back again. So actually the normal thing is to have Asherah in the temple, in Solomon's temple. The unusual state of affairs is not to have it there. And that's from the information provided in the books of the Hebrew Bible themselves.
Well, would that go back to where Akhenaten decided to create a singular god, and then Tut went back and brought all of the gods and goddesses back after his father was killed or died?
Well, it's interesting. It seems to be a feature of monotheism, accepting that Akhenaten, was the first monotheist, the first to elevate one god. Is as soon as you get into that position, you start wanting to get rid of all the other cults, and it happened when they codified Judaism and made it monotheist. They then start to get rid of. It becomes a very divisive thing. It starts to become an us and them thing. So Akhenaten wanted to get rid of any rival cult, which other Egyptians hadn't. Egyptian rulers had favoured one god over another, but they didn't try and eliminate the others.
And it shows you what the psychology was that was involved in this, because of course Akhenaten, trying to impose his monotheism on the Egyptian people, they hated him for it. They, where's our goddesses? Where's Isis? Where's our goddesses? And you can't get away with it. Certainly not in the Egyptian religion or the Egyptian mindset, which craved goddesses. But actually, when you think about it, everybody craves a goddess, whether they know it or not.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm wondering if the figure, the persona of Asherah or Sophia or any of them, if it's not necessarily that person, but that level of consciousness people are seeking. So that you want wisdom, you want gentleness, so this person represents that. So that's what you're drawn to. I think that the whole philosophy of monotheism doesn't really work, because there are so many different cults, sects, whatever. I mean, you had even that, destroying the sects in early Christianity as well, because there were tons of different sects, cults, whatever, of Christianity at one time, until they started to sort of beat them into submission and pull them all into the one Roman Catholic Church.
Well, yes, and that's actually very interesting, because we realized, actually just a few days ago, that in both Judaism and Christianity, the goddess was thrown out, basically. In both cases, when the religion was codified, when the rules were set up, and which is, of course, a very, very male thing to do. This is the way you're going to do it, or else.
Yeah.
So you have certainly the various committees and councils, like Nicaea in the 3rd, 4th century, basically setting up what, as you say, what became Roman Catholic religion, or Christianity as it was then. And basically, they threw out everything to do with a goddess or everything to do with the sacred feminine. It was their idea of what they wanted Christianity to be, and there was no room for the goddess in it. And that's essentially what happened when they were codifying Judaism. The men decided there's no room for a goddess here. And little did they realize, or perhaps they didn't care, that they were actually condemning generations of their followers or generations of their people to a really, at the very least, uneasy relationship with themselves, actually, with various aspects of themselves. But I mean, really condemning them to a complete imbalanced psychology and, if you like, soul.
Yeah, it seems to me that you have to have logic and reason, or well, you don't have to, but it makes life easier if you have it.
Yeah.
And it just, to me, I see no harm in having a sacred feminine that stands alongside the quote unquote God, and so you have a God and goddess, and they don't have to be. First of all, marriage isn't all that. Marriage is an institution that has been created, but there has always been a balance of male and female, whether or not the element of marriage is brought into it or not. There's a pairing.
Yeah, and actually, it's interesting that in Christianity you have a Trinity, which is assumed anyway to be all male. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, which is taken to be male. So, no suggestion of any sacred feminine at all there. But the ancient Egyptian Trinity was Father, Mother, and Child. I mean, how much more psychologically healthy is that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And the Holy Spirit, became part of the Christian Trinity, originally was female, was perceived of as a female force or entity, and it's only part of this creating the dogma of the Trinity that suddenly the Holy Spirit becomes seen as male, because in that context of what they're trying to do in that dogma, it couldn't be anything else. But prior to that, it had always been looked upon as a female force in the same way that wisdom was.
How did they get away with this, though? I mean, was it when they wanted to have something in writing that at that particular point in time it was the males that had the dominance and the control? I mean, it doesn't make sense to me that they were able to, as you so gently put it, airbrush out the females, because they were originally in scriptures and things like that, but they seem to have been removed. And even in places during the time of Jesus, they've taken the names of females out to kind of diminish their validity or their purpose in his discipleship.
Well, you can get away with a lot if you threaten those who go against what you say with, being burnt on a pyre or something.
Yeah, that would work.
Yeah, it would work, wouldn't it? Yes, it would work with me, I have to say. I like
Sure.
a shot. But also, certainly where Christianity is concerned, sorry to put it so bluntly, but to me, the Catholic Church has got away with an awful lot over the years because it could. Because not only was it violent towards those who crossed it in any way, but also because most of its flock couldn't read. So basically, the only person in the neighborhood who could read would be the local priest, and he would tell you what the Bible said, and he would tell you what the Pope said, and he would tell you what you have to believe. And you weren't educated, and you just thought, he's God's representative around here, so we just have to listen to it. So basically, for centuries and centuries they could get away with it because the awkward bits of the New Testament, of the Christian Bible, they would never know them. They would just never come across them for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, if you take it into the New Testament, then you get the story of Jesus, which is, there's so much contradiction here and there, and what I've run across in so many different places have been, the kind of toss up, who was the Messiah, Jesus or John the Baptist?
Well, yes, and it was certainly a toss up between the followers of both of them.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that most Christians don't even have an inkling of. They don't even know about that. Because they fall for the propaganda in the New Testament, which, after all, as you said, history being written by the victors, and the victors in that little showdown were, of course, if you like, the Jesus faction, not the John the Baptist faction. But actually, the truth is, and this again has been pieced together by academics, the truth is that John the Baptist and Jesus were arch rivals. Although the evidence is that Jesus began as one of John the Baptist's disciples himself, but then broke away, and John became very suspicious, if you like, of what he was up to and what he was saying and doing. And actually, there is a bit in the New Testament itself which most people who read it obviously just don't notice it. It just passes, over their heads. But there's a bit where John the Baptist is in Herod's jail, and he gets a message out to Jesus saying, "Are you really the one who is to come, or do we look for another?" So at the very, very last minute before he's murdered, before he's executed, he has doubts about Jesus. And, considering that he's supposed to have fallen down and said, "This is the Messiah, everybody worship him," this is astonishing. But, people don't draw attention to it and nobody notices it.
Well, during those times, though, didn't they? I mean, they had prophecies of a Messiah, and there were so many Messiah-like people coming up. It was almost like they'd say, "Oh, it's another one."
Yeah.
And
yeah. I mean, we always say that probably the most accurate biblical movie ever made, certainly as far as the New Testament is concerned, is actually the life of Brian.
Yes.
That has more research in it than anything else.
Yeah.
And the scenes in that where they portray all the different prophets and people sort of standing around giving their different messages. That's the way it was. We've always had that impression that people were just milling around. Jesus came along, and a lot of people said, this is the Messiah. The rest of the people rejected him, and that's the kind of end of the story. But there was lots of people claiming, and it wasn't just the Messiah, because of just the times that they were living in, under the oppression of the Romans and everything like that. There were all these kind of different expectations flying around. Some people thought that God was going to come back into the world. Some thought that God was going to send an angel to save the people. Some people thought that there was this thing called a prophet like Moses, that a similar prophet, like a super prophet kind of thing, was going to arise. So there are many, many different expectations. There wasn't just of the Messiah. The Messiah itself was supposed to be basically a military leader, a king, supposed to be a spiritual figure at all. And so, he's just got all these different ideas and expectations that somebody was going to happen. And what's interesting, Jesus seems to have played up to several of them. And one of the interesting things that we've always found is that, when John the Baptist, as he seemed to at the beginning of Jesus' mission, did seem to kind of elevate him as somebody and saying, this is the person we're waiting for, never uses the word Messiah. He just calls him the one who was to come. Also, when, as Lynn said, this message that John the Baptist got out of prison, questioning Jesus. He doesn't say, "Are you really the Messiah?" He says, "Are you really the one who is to come, or should we seek another?" And it's almost like they're avoiding using a specific term, which incidentally is one of the things that indicates that those passages are genuine, because if a later Christian had made them up, he would have just said Christ, not left it so vague. But yeah, fascinating things going on then.
Yeah. You're the Messiah. I should know. I followed a few.
Yeah.
If you really want to get a feel for what it was actually really like, then watch Life of Brian.
Exactly, yeah. One of the best researched movies of all time. Yeah.
It really is a good movie. I mean, it is. Yes, it's funny and poignant at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
But you start thinking, okay, so they had doubts. Maybe he had doubts. I mean, could it be they're still waiting for the first Messiah?
Or one of these other figures. So there's all these other expectations. I mean, a thing that is very significant in the history as we've reconstructed it, is that not enough attention is given to the Samaritans and Samaria. That appears to be the key. For example, it is where the evidence that we've unearthed indicates that when the goddess was erased from Judaism, the religion of the tribe of Judah centered in Jerusalem, the goddess worship actually survived in Samaria, and that becomes very important in the story that we have to tell. But everybody knows, we all know back from Sunday school that the Jews and the Samaritans didn't get on with each other, but people never really stopped to think why they didn't. And in fact, that rivalry goes way, way back, right back to the time of, just after the time of King Solomon. In fact, actually before that, to David, because there was a big rivalry between two of the tribes over which one led, not just politically but religiously. One was the tribe of Ephraim, that was the original leader, the ones that originally had the Ark of the Covenant, and then there was the tribe of Judah that came to the fore later, took power from them, took the Ark of the Covenant from the tribe of Ephraim. Now, the Samaritans were the descendants of the tribe of Ephraim. And so they had this huge rivalry. And both claimed that they represented the true religion as it had been taught and practiced by Moses. They each claimed the other one had got it wrong, had kind of perverted the religion. Now, history being written by the victors, yet again, the Bible was written by the tribe of Judah, so it makes them into the people that were right, and the Samaritans were wrong. We think it was the other way around, that actually it was the Samaritans who retained the correct original form with the other gods and the goddess in it, and that becomes it's a big part of the story that we tell.
Well, it's interesting in that you have all of this political stuff going on, and yet the message that comes through, and it's unfortunate that even the Bible has muddied the message that was being given to humanity.
Well, yes, and it's mostly due to this business of trying to codify religions and lay down rules about this is what you're going to believe. Certainly with the New Testament, when you're thinking about just something quite simple, like how did the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John end up there? And that was, as you know, through a series of votes of councils of men who decided that they were the best examples of what they wanted the new religion of Christianity to be like. And so it's interesting to look at what they rejected. And what they rejected were books very like the so-called Gnostic Gospels, many of which were found again, discovered in 1945 in Egypt. The Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, although that was found somewhat earlier, but Gospel of Mary, brackets Magdalene. Nobody is claiming, by the way, that the people that Mary actually wrote it. Sadly, in those days, people stuck somebody's name on a book, and that was fine. It wouldn't be fine now, but but yeah. So it's ever since I discovered, we discovered about the Gnostic Gospels, the ones that were not included in the New Testament. The forbidden books, and we've only got a few of them, but there were possibly hundreds of them, saying very different things about Jesus and his mission and the people that he surrounded himself with. But those are the books that have clues to what he was really about, which of course means that by saying that, we are taking issue with the guys who invented, if you like, or codified the Catholic religion.
Well, yeah. I mean, it just, to me, by rejecting all of the others, what you see here is the creation of a religion, and then a corporate entity, and then a dictatorship.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah. It is corporate.
Yeah.
But it is one of those. It's the things Lynn said earlier about making the rules. And it is a matter of, once you've made rules and you've said, this is right in terms of belief, then by definition you have to say anyone that believes anything different is wrong. Yeah. And that's when the trouble starts.
You've got to be on mission. Yeah. Talking of corporate, on mission, yes, and stick to the brand name.
But it naturally, once you go through that process, it naturally creates intolerance, because you can't say, well, okay, someone believes something slightly different, but that's okay, because you've now got rules. This is what you believe.
Or else.
The famous the Nicene Creed, for example. That you have to believe that Jesus is one and the same as God, which I kind of never entirely got my head around. But that was just one choice that was picked by an emperor, Emperor Theodosius, in 381. Yeah. He was the one that decreed that Christianity could be the only religion of the empire, but he didn't just decree that. He said it's only one sort of Christianity, because, as you said earlier, there were so many different versions, so many different interpretations. But he said, no, only the version that is set out in the Nicene Creed, agreed at the Council of Nicaea, is correct. Anyone else, even if they claim to be a Christian, even if they revere Jesus, if they don't believe that particular creed, then they're punished. And anyone that adheres to any other religion at all the other pagan religions. And it just seems to be this consequence of, it does have a political element. The Emperor Theodosius had political reasons in part for doing this. It enabled him to control things better. But as soon as you start to get down to there is only one God and there's only one set of rules, then the inevitable consequence is intolerance.
But it's interesting, that the Catholic Church has all these different saints who, govern, if you like, various aspects of life. They're patron saint of so-and-so, the patron saint of so-and-so. And that is a very watered-down version of having lots of gods. So it's like it's a strange, perhaps unconscious recognition that people want that.
Well, if the gods, that were extra and left over became angels, then that just makes sense that, you take your gods that have extra powers and extra, because in order to become a saint, you have to have documented miracles, ergo a god. So it's the same system under a different name. I mean, what's wrong with as far as I can tell, and it's just my own personal belief system, and it's not carved in stone. I change it daily. But right today, it just seems ridiculous to me that a religion or a belief or a connection to a god or goddess is a very personal experience, and it shouldn't have anything to do with what you feel or think or anybody else. So have they taken the concept of religion and made it a political tool today?
Well, it is, and that's very much the difference, isn't it, between organized religion and spirituality? Because spirituality is a private thing, and actually, it's one of the last things that they can't control. It's what goes on in your own mind and in your own soul. They can't control that, or at least hopefully they can't. But an organized religion, you can tell people, and of course this has happened, as we know, over and over again, and it's still happening on a huge scale. The priests just lay down the law and say you're going to hell if you don't do this, or if you do this, and they have absolute power, and that it constantly feeds itself. The power goes back to the source. And it's beyond politics after a while. It's a thing all by itself. Just like, there's such a thing as Vatican City. It's a state, all by itself.
True. Well, but the reality is the sacred feminine is still there. I'm seeing far more people, investigating paganism. And the fact that the sacred feminine is there. The sacred feminine is even still in the Bible when you talk about Mary Magdalene being the consort of Jesus.
Yes, the consort, but we don't agree that they were legally married, which of course sets us on a bit of a path that is different from a lot of people. But what we say is that Mary was Jesus' beloved. In many respects, she was his priestess. She was his great beloved, and he's kind of one person in a circle. They were spiritual equals. She was an amazing woman, not perfect, but an amazing woman. But people say, oh, well, obviously they were married. Well, no, there's actually no evidence they were actually married. Jesus must have been married at one point in his life, because at that time and at that place, every single boy aged about 16, certainly towards the age of 20, had to be married. No excuses, no exceptions, just had to be married. So Jesus would have been married to somebody, way back, but we don't know what happened to that wife. It almost certainly was not Mary Magdalene, who is treated very oddly by the writers of the books of the New Testament,
Well, yeah, and they called him rabbi, and all rabbis are married.
Yeah.
Well, actually, all men were then.
But wait, who invented marriage?
Oh, there's a question.
There is a question, yes.
I suppose, when you think, every culture must have had their kind of symbolic...
handfast type thing. Yes.
Joining of a man and woman into a new family. Yeah. Which is obviously regarded as joining the two families as well, of course. Yeah. So they must have had, but is it something that has always been? I don't know. Very good question.
Very good question,
Never thought of that. But,
it became a legal document, a legal thing that happened. But, if you go back far enough, people stayed together while they got along together, and when they didn't, they just went their ways. When did marriage become so restrictive?
Yeah. Well, again, I think we're talking about, it must be, when you think about it, talking about some kind of period of codification, laying down the laws. But don't know when.
Well, so they were partners.
Yes, exactly, in every sense. Yes.
But there was also what I call a sacred marriage element, which may have kind of contributed to the idea that they were actually man and wife, because there was certainly amongst some of the other, the alternative Christian sects in the early days, this rite called the bridal chamber, which was the highest rite above baptism and all the others, which does appear to have involved, as in many cult sects and religions of in the ancient world, a I was going to say a symbolic union of priest and priestess. It wasn't symbolic; it was an actual union, but it was symbolizing the union of the god and goddess. And there's a lot of bride and bridegroom imagery actually in the New Testament Gospels, which, taken out of the contexts of a kind of sacred marriage thing, doesn't make an awful lot of sense. So over the centuries, over the last 2,000 years, theologians have tried to explain what this, why Jesus keeps talking about himself as a bridegroom and saying, well, it's obviously symbolizing his marriage to the church, which of course is an anachronism because it didn't exist then. But then when you put it together with these, these Gnostic sources that have this ritual of the bride of the bedchamber, it starts to make a lot of sense. And when you see Mary Magdalene as a priestess, which is what we think the evidence shows that she was.
I mean, she did the most amazing thing, and it's, strangely enough, there it is in the New Testament itself. She christened Jesus. She marked him out for his great fate, whatever that might be, but, for his great destiny. Because the name or the title Christ actually means anointed one. Mm-hmm. And there's no other anointing in the New Testament apart from the woman with the jar full of perfumed oil who anoints Jesus. And the men, the likes of St. Peter standing around, had no idea what was going on and obviously got their reaction completely wrong. They basically sneered. They sneered at her, but Jesus said, no, she's doing an amazing thing. And Jesus said, obviously not in literally these words, but he said, wherever the gospel is preached, her name will be celebrated. And isn't it interesting that it's not? In fact, actually, you have to do a lot of digging to work out that it's Mary Magdalene who is doing it, because the woman doing the christening, the anointing, is in fact not named at all. But she did the amazing thing, and she and Jesus obviously knew what it meant. It was a ritual that had obviously been set up by them in advance, and the men, the male disciples, who everybody in Christianity supposes were Jesus' inner circle, who knew everything about what he was about, had no idea what this was, this amazing anointing by this woman. And the fact that she was a woman, of course, but I mean, they do say, what is this woman doing? It was a very big thing with them. And if you look at the Gnostic Gospels, like the Gospel of Philip or the Gospel of Thomas, basically everything leaps into sharp focus, and you see that, in fact, the male disciples, especially Simon Peter, hated Mary Magdalene because she had this immense power in the movement. And, to be blunt, she appeared to have some power over Jesus. I mean, in the Gnostic Gospel, she even gets Jesus to change his doctrine by suggesting something else. And he says, oh yes, absolutely, brilliant, let's go with it. So she was very important, but she was sailing very close to the wind with the men, especially Peter. I mean, again, from the Gnostic Gospels, we know that, he actually threatened to kill her.
Jesus and Mary had a synchronicity of spiritual understanding and communication between them. There's no doubt about that. And I think maybe they didn't want to portray her as being as intellectually gifted as he was, and that his message was something that they both understood and worked at, trying to get it out to the populace.
Yes, I think that's a large part of it. They certainly worked in partnership, Jesus and Mary Magdalene. I think part of the reason was that they was, I think Jesus was playing a bit of a, he had to balance things, because the reconstruction that we have from the story that we put together is that a large part of the purpose of Jesus' mission was to try to restore the sacred feminine that had been written out.
Mm-hmm.
Only a few centuries before, not that long ago, and which we believe had the original form of the religion, even though it's now very tightly controlled by the temple in Jerusalem. What the religion had been was remembered underground secretly in Samaria, also amongst Jewish and Samaritan groups that had settled in Egypt, and they're specifically talked about in the Bible. So that this idea that there had been a goddess, that there had been a goddess who had her own priesthood, which was both male and female, the priest and priestesses as part of that. That this survived underground, and it was an important part of what Jesus and Mary Magdalene were about, was trying to bring that back. But certainly when they moved into Jerusalem, which is obviously the center of the religion, the center of authority, they had to be a little bit careful about the goddess elements of it. So which probably accounts for why he's trying to play to two audiences. One is the Jewish audience that has been for a few generations under the control of the temple, and don't understand the bits about sacred feminine. You have to introduce that very carefully.
Yeah.
So he's got his male disciples who don't appear to know the full story, and obviously led by Peter, because it's very clear from the New Testament Gospels that there's a group around Jesus, which includes Mary Magdalene, which includes the family at Bethany where he stays just before the final days in Jerusalem, that kind of are behind the mission, that facilitate the mission, that help the mission, but that the disciples don't really understand, and it doesn't include them. So I think part of the reason that the New Testament Gospels wrote Mary Magdalene out is in large part the group of early Christians that were responsible for those Gospels actually didn't fully understand what it was about. But nevertheless, they still went further than that. And, partly it was just confusion. What is this woman doing? How does this fit into Jewish ritual? Well, it doesn't.
Yeah.
But that was part of the motivation. But I think it went further than that. There was an element of actual misogyny in this.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that so many people miss or don't get is that it was not his intent to create another religion. His intent was to alter Judaism to more embrace what its original purpose was.
Yeah, exactly. But having said that, of course, there is also the element of that almost certainly Jesus and virtually everybody that is talked about in the New Testament would believe that the world would end within a generation or two of their own time. So everything that they said has to be really seen against a backdrop of the coming apocalypse, as far as they were concerned. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a shock to realise that, the fact that we're sitting here talking to you about this in the 21st century. Jesus would be shocked if he knew that there was a 21st century.
Probably shocked at what they've done with his teachings, because there is a purity to them, a simplicity of them that goes back to the golden rule, among other things. But his intent, I don't think, was to cause a revolution. It was to create a greater wholeness in his own time frame, his own period of time.
I think there was inevitably a political dimension to what he was doing, because it couldn't be otherwise, given everything that was going on there. The expectations of the Jewish people, all of the Hebrew people, the Samaritans included, that they were going to be delivered from the oppression of the Romans. So anyone that stands up, again, going back to Life of Brian, makes it very clear, tells us brilliantly, that, inevitably anyone that had a religious message had to also have a political message. It would always be seen that way. So, and we think that there was that element. Jesus is trying to restore the religion to what it had been, but that also has this, a large part of that is also bringing together the different tribes, which includes the Samaritans. Trying to get the Samaritans and Jews to work together was not going to be an easy task after all these literally hundreds of years of rivalry between the two. And he's challenging the temple authority, which has a big political power that works together with the Romans to sort of keep the status quo running. So it's not just a spiritual message that's in the teaching. There is inevitably this political aspect, which Jesus was fully aware of and was, that's part of his mission too. It wasn't solely about, the teaching. Teachings are important, of course, and one of the most interesting things that we found in the research for this book was the significance in Jesus' teaching of wisdom, of Sophia, which isn't just wisdom with a small w. Sophia was a female figure, but essentially a goddess figure, a sort of repackaging of Asherah and the wisdom tradition that had gone with her into a kind of a new form to try and kind of slide it past people. But it's very much that Jesus portrayed himself as the messenger of Sophia, so essentially as the messenger of a female wisdom figure.
And we wonder who that was. I don't think a certain lady would have let him forget that she was there in the background.
Probably not.
No, certainly.
It's funny in every portrayal I've ever seen of this story and everything that came about, it's all very flat, and there's no insightful anything to it. It's a flat story, and when you see it that flat, you know that you're not getting the whole picture. And it's you have nothing of his first 30 years, and it's sort of like I once said to somebody about who was it? About one of the gurus that people were following, and it was a female. And I said to this friend of mine, I said, look, she's got to have cramps and bad days just like the rest of us. Yes, and she looked at me like, you can't say that about her.
Oh, yes, exactly. Yeah.
And it's like, even Jesus, come on. He was born of human. He was human, but he was also a God, but he was also human. And that means, you often wonder if he hit his thumb and he had to swear, what would he have sworn by? The beards of our fathers. He certainly couldn't have said Jesus Christ. So,
But actually, I've come in for quite a bit of flack from various communities in the New Age who believe or seem to believe that Mary Magdalene is an untouchable goddess and you can't even question her. My line, of course, is pretty much your line about Jesus. She existed. She was a woman. She represented the goddess in rituals, but she was not a goddess. And actually, if you read the Gnostic Gospels, her personality, even after all this time, does emerge. And she was actually quite abrasive, very manipulative, at one point, and quite condescending, actually, because at one point she says to Jesus about some point of doctrine they'd obviously been talking about, just the two of them. And she says, why don't you tell the others about that thing we were talking about? She said, so that even they might understand. And you think, oh dear. And she also was incredibly assertive, which is obviously a good thing. But, she obviously had no time for any of the niceties and the finesse of being a woman in that time and place. possibly because, she spent a lot of time in Egypt, and, basically, as a woman of means, she was rich, that, basically she would have it all, pretty much all her own way because of the egalitarian society of Egypt in those days. Mm-hmm. So she wouldn't really care about these rough men from Galilee, they would be appalled by her knocking around with her hair loose and, standing up and opining, voicing her own opinions, and saying, as I said earlier, at one point saying to Jesus, actually, let's think about that, shall we? That point of doctrine you just raised. What about if it's this instead? And Jesus saying, oh, no, that's just wonderful. Well done, thou good and faithful Magdalene, There's a lot of that. There's a lot of that going on. So, yeah, I mean, now, she was certainly no unhuman being, that you can't challenge. I mean, I like her all the more for it. She was just very, very human.
Well, does that explain sort of, I mean, I know Peter hated her. Yeah. So yeah. Is that possibly part of the reason why in some stories she left she left Israel and she went to France in order to escape? And
make sense. It does make sense, a lot of sense, because there's certainly over and over you get this almost pitch battles between Magdalene and Peter, and sometimes some of the other male disciples in the Gnostic Gospels. And Peter threatens to kill her. Jesus smooths it all over yet again, but then for whatever reason Jesus is out of the picture, and Mary basically has to run for it. I mean, that's the impression you get. And certainly, given the setup, her relationship with the men and with Peter, you can imagine once Jesus isn't there to look after her, she would have to go. And it made sense to go to France, or Gaul as it then was, because that's where a lot of rich Jews had actually, they had holiday homes. I mean, it's funny to put it like that, but they did. So,
Yeah, Pontius Pilate retired there. So this was the place where you retired to. You had your villa. Yeah. It's right at the other end of the empire to Jerusalem. So if you're going to get away, that's the logical place to be.
Yeah.
It's not as strange as it sounds with her fleeing for France.
So that would explain the Cathars and the fact that so many, that there is definitely a significant group of people that not above Jesus, but certainly alongside him, they worship her. I mean, there's no other way to put it.
Yeah, certainly in the early days when presumably because she arrived there and started, as the local legends still have it, she started preaching and baptizing. She baptized, and actually the traditionalists there don't seem to realize the significance of that. They say, oh, yes, she baptized. And you think, she was a woman. Come on, think about it. That is so jaw-dropping. But anyway, she did all of that, and she presumably converted a lot of people. But there was effectively a Church of Mary Magdalene in that area of France, and possibly, extended elsewhere. And yes, an awful lot of we might call primitive Christian beliefs seem to surface in the medieval Cathar so-called heresy.
It just, to me, it's when you look around how there has been over time, thousands of years, a struggle to bring back that balance of the sacred feminine along with the God figure, because it feels like it's a balance we've lost in the times that are to come. A balance is going to be a much easier way to deal with whatever comes our way.
Well, yes, and it's the way we're heading now. A lot of people now realize we need that balance. A lot of shows like yours and the interest in kind of books that we've written, which would have been impossible to write 100 years ago or something.
You think?
But there is growing awareness of this. Partly as people now can read and are allowed to think for themselves, which they didn't used to be, but also they're aware of the what's missing inside themselves, and seeing where it comes, what the missing piece is. The way women are beginning to assert themselves, their rights, just in an everyday kind of political workspace sense, asserting what they should always have been, is one big part of it. But of course, there's the spiritual side that people are now beginning to explore. But the subtitle of our book, we've called our book "When God Had a Wife." Like with every title, it's just so that to make people stop and think and say, "Hey, why don't we look up?" The subtitle is you have to grab the audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we put the subtitle as it's the fall and rise of the sacred feminine in the Judeo-Christian tradition, not as people might expect, the rise and fall, because it was something. It was there to begin with in the Israelite religion, in what became the Judeo-Christian tradition. It was there to begin with, and it was taken out. It fell, but as you said, over the last couple of thousand years, there's been various groups trying to put it back in, and now she is rising again, inevitably. It's just unstoppably. So and it's coming about both from a kind of spiritual revival, but it's also coming about from the discoveries of academic things, archaeology, of scholars actually looking at the text and the language and the translations, and actually saying this has been translated wrongly for the last however many thousand years. What these words actually mean is something quite different. So a big reason for us writing the book was to make the point of how the hard facts, the actual archaeological discoveries, textual discoveries, scholarship, and the kind of the spiritual side are coming together.
And also the idea of a balance, obviously psychologically and spiritually, is exactly what we need at the moment, and it's been striven for. But of course there is a problem there, and that is that balance is very, very hard to maintain. I mean, it's more or less impossible, but it's the striving to maintain the balance that is the important thing. And one thing that bothers me slightly is that while I'm 100% behind the whole idea of bringing the goddess back and celebrating the goddess, but it worries me slightly that in the years to come, the masculine male principle will be denigrated, because that's not balance. Balance is the two being celebrated together.
It worries me too.
I can't think why.
No, I mean, I can see it that I'm going to be blamed for all the generations of men that have gone the other way. So it wasn't my fault. I wasn't around then. But it's an important.
It's the sacred feminine within everybody, as well as the sacred male. I mean, it's men who are compassionate and recognize that aspect of themselves, and women who recognize a greater strength within themselves to draw attention to themselves and say, listen to me, I have something to say, instead of, yes, dear, okay.
Exactly. I mean, it's what I was going to say. That it is not, it's not just women that have lost by this removal of the divine feminine. Obviously, women have lost more, undeniably, but men have lost out too. It's damaged them, damaged their psyche. So that's part of what's being brought back. It's going to help men too. It's not just a matter of putting men back in their place. It's us, both men and women, finding their place.
But when you think about it, I mean, medieval churchmen actually seriously debated whether women have souls. But when you have that kind of mindset, operating at every level from the Vatican downwards to your local priest, it's going to affect not only individual women but their children, some of whom obviously are going to be boys. So everybody is affected by this disrespect, to put it mildly, for the feminine. everybody. It's going to filter down to, little boy babies and, and children growing up. And the attitude has undermined generation upon generation of people. I mean, it's true, if you look across the world at other religions that have goddesses, it's true to say that, they're not necessarily sparkling examples of egalitarian everyday life.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly within Judaism and Christianity, you can trace back certain really poor attitudes to women, to what happened to the goddess.
Well, look at this country. It wasn't until the 1900s that women were thought to have the brains to be able to vote.
Well, exactly. Yes.
Or to attend university.
Yeah.
I mean, same in the UK. I don't know when it was that the first universities started allowing women in, but it was certainly well into the 19th century.
Well into the 20th. I mean, women could, I believe it's true to say that certainly in Britain, women could attend university in the early 20th century, but not actually graduate.
Oh, no, they couldn't take the degree.
They couldn't take the
places,
degree,
yeah.
no.
When I even look back on my own life, when I'm 75, so when I was in college, it was you could be a secretary, a nurse, a teacher, or an airline hostess, and that was about it. And so it's kind of like, I think that this, and I'm not so sure it's sacred, but there's an acknowledgement that there is a balance, that there is room for two sexes to have a balance between them. It isn't just that men have it all and women have to be subservient. And well, wait, you go all the way back to the very beginning, at least in the Bible, where they say that woman was created first.
Well, yeah.
Well, yes. I mean, something we discuss in the book is different interpretations of the Adam and Eve story, which is normally sort of looked at as being, well, man is there first. Eve is created as his helper, as we say, and that has been looked on for generations as being indicating that God himself put women in a subservient position. And it's only been in the 1970s that a woman scholar went back and looked at those texts and said, okay, it says Eve was created as Adam's helper. I can't remember Isa is the word in Hebrew. But actually, in other places, exactly the same word is given to God as man's helper, and you're not going to say that God says his subordinate, So it's the way that word has been interpreted for a long time. Whereas it's it's to help you, but it doesn't necessarily have a subversive implication.
Mind you, that just going off at a slight tangent there, but talking about the deliberate downplaying of female roles by the use of language. In the New Testament, you have, for almost the entire time of Christianity, you've had people saying, Jesus did not have female disciples. But he quite clearly did. But yes, he quite clearly did. He quite clearly did, because in the New Testament, the same word that is translated for the male disciples as disciples is the word that has traditionally been translated for the women as followers, as mere followers. But it's the same word. It's disciples and disciples.
Well, one of my favourite examples from the Old Testament of just how the way you interpret words changes the image of what you're talking about. An important figure in the story that we tell is Deborah, who was one of the judges. This between the Israelites coming into the Promised Land and the establishment of the kingdom under David. It's really a tribal confederation ruled by what is called in the Bible judges. And an important one of those is a woman named Deborah. She's described also as a prophetess. and from her symbolism, she's very connected with Asherah and the wisdom tradition. She's also described, she's one of those that has this title, Mother in Israel, which is kind of counselor to the king. And she plays a big part in a particular war that happens with the Canaanites. But she also has another phrase described to her, which in the Bible is translated as wife of Lapidoth. She's just Lapidoth's wife. And strange enough, there is no character of that name mentioned, or even the fact she has a husband. And it's been pointed out, actually in Hebrew, wife and woman is the same word. And also, Lapidoth actually means torches or fire. So you can translate her name as woman of fire, which is a lot different from wife of some guy you've never heard of. And it's just down to interpretation. You change exactly the same words, you translate them differently, and you have a completely different view of this woman from being an obscure guy's wife to a woman of fire.
Be interesting, wouldn't it, to do a kind of feminist version of the Bible with the proper translations of the words?
Yep.
Yeah. We don't have the patience, sadly.
Or the Hebrew.
There is that.
But there's a lot of this, and it does say that translation of particular words to do with Eve in the Adam and Eve story, that if you look at them in a different way, actually change the balance of that story entirely. And according to some scholars, is also talking about a wisdom tradition that begins with Eve. This is the tradition that the Hebrew prophetesses go back to. And it's something in some of the early Christian sources we're looking at, it's the complete opposite way of the way Peter looks at it.
Oh, yeah, it would be, wouldn't it?
Because Peter in these, there's some... Then was talking earlier about Peter's hatred of Mary Magdalene in particular, and women in general in these Gnostic texts. And we always thought this has the ring of truth to it because of the way the personalities are portrayed, as Lynn said. But there was still no kind of, you're looking at those texts and saying, is there anything separate and independent we can compare that to? And in the research for this book, we found actually there is some early Syrian Christian sources in which are based on a text attributed to Peter called the Teachings of Peter, which scholars have reconstructed. And what Peter talks about in that, he's saying that there were two types of prophecy. There's male prophecy and there's female prophecy. But only male prophecy is the real prophecy. And they both go back to Adam and Eve. Adam started the male line of prophecy. Eve started the female line. But it's only the male line that's valid. That's real prophecy. The female line, female prophecy, is false prophecy. This gives rise to the false prophets. It gives rise to the people that the true prophets, the male prophets, have to come to correct and to counteract. And interestingly, just as an aside, one of the people he includes in the female line of prophecy is John the Baptist, and says that's why he had to come first, so that Jesus Christ, who's the male line of prophets, has to come to correct what he said. Now, it's interesting that this, you've got, again, quite a misogynistic line in these teachings of Peter's from these early Syrian Christian traditions, totally independent of those Gnostic Gospels, but still portraying and having nothing to say about Mary Magdalene in particular in those, because this is actually dealing with Peter after the crucifixion, that it's still portraying him as somebody that has a very negative view of the feminine and of women in particular, of women, which is like two completely different sources giving you the same image of this man, who of course is the person that the Church of Rome is based upon. And
that in itself is fascinating, though, because, of course, while, as we were talking earlier about the fact that for centuries and centuries, most ordinary Catholics couldn't read. They had to be told what was in the Bible, had to be told everything. And during that time, obviously, they believed that St. Peter, had become the Pope because he was the first person to see Jesus after the resurrection. Wrong. The first person, if you read the Bible, the first person to encounter the risen Jesus was Mary Magdalene. Of course, over the course of the last couple of centuries, various people have pointed this out to the Catholic Church, and they fall back on the line, really, yeah, but she was a woman, so she didn't count.
Ah. And when she rushed to tell the disciples, they didn't believe her.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because she's a woman.
Well, there was another, I think it was in the Middle Ages, standard Christian, must be Catholic interpretation of that particular episode. Yeah, where someone said, well, why did Jesus choose to appear first to a woman? And I said, well, the easiest way to get your message out is to tell a woman, because she'd get to everybody. You know? And it was, and these were kind of serious theological statements at one point.
Yeah.
We may laugh now.
Well, I think we'd all have some rather choice words for Peter if we could summon him up now.
Probably.
It's strange, this thing that, yes, he is the person that traditionally, founded the church. Even the tradition historically is a little dubious, but nevertheless, it's fascinating that he's supposed to be the person that founded a church which has not exactly been very kind or positive about women throughout its history.
Well, Jesus said, I believe, thou art Peter, and upon you will I build my church. And what I find fascinating is that there were no churches then.
Yeah, exactly. And he had no intention of starting a church anyway.
He couldn't have said that.
No.
But they had to come up with some reason why he's called Peter, which is probably more Peter meaning rock. That's fun. And Jesus did give him this nickname of Peter based on rock. So they had to come up with an idea of why he made this kind of play on words. It's more likely a reference to Peter's temperament.
Yeah.
Or perhaps his head was as solid as a rock.
Yeah, I was just thinking maybe he was just... Well, I mean, there's a whole bit in one of the Gnostic Gospels where Jesus basically loses it with Peter and says, I've tried to explain the gospel to you. I've tried to explain all these spiritual truths to you over and over again, but you are too stupid. You're too dim to get it. Basically, please focus. And this is not the St. Peter that the Catholic Church would have us believe in, basically. An entirely different sort of person, but who hated Mary Magdalene, who Jesus adored. And there's another implication there, which is Peter founded this church, and it became very much his church, very misogynistic and very keen to basically wipe the Magdalene off the face of the earth as far as they could. I mean, yes, she's in the New Testament, but she's hardly there by name.
Yeah.
You get the impression that if they could have, they would have left her out entirely, but she was too well known, so they had to leave her in. A bit. But yeah, so basically the if you like, the early Vatican, the very, very early Vatican, when they were deciding how to frame their new church, their new religion, essentially, they very clearly decided that they weren't going to have much Mary in there, because she was obviously to them a byword for very assertive, very vocal women. And the point was that Jesus encouraged her to be both those things. He wanted her to be herself. He gave her a platform to speak, as becomes very obvious if you read the Gnostic Gospels, and not just her, actually, other women in the following too, but mainly her. There's one bit where there's 42 question and answer session, and she answers 39 of them.
Don't you find it a little amusing that the Catholic Church itself was so male-dominated, it was unbelievable, and yet they have had a female pope?
Well, according to legend.
According to legend, yes.
Yeah.
But but didn't she have to pretend that she was a man?
Yeah, she did
to
have
get
to
the job
pretend she was a man. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Until she had a baby.
Yeah. Well, yes. There's an unfortunate incident, one might say.
Which is why, don't they now have every pope when he's elected has to sit upon a throne with a cutout so they can have a look underneath and check?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, really?
Yeah, yes, it's all part of the ritual. Yes, going back to that. But I mean, I know it sounds a ridiculous thing to say, but I keep saying it these days. But whenever on television or whatever, you see the Pope and all the cardinals sitting there, and you think, where are the women? It's the 21st century, guys. Come on. But of course, they are never going to let the reins go. They are never, ever going to let what to them would be another Magdalene figure come in, because they'd be afraid she'd take over.
Well, it's another consequence of what we were talking about earlier, of when you fix doctrine and you fix the rules. One of the implications is that anyone that doesn't believe it is wrong. But the other thing, it makes it very hard to change your mind, because you suddenly have to say, oh, that thing we've been telling you for 2,000 years, actually we decided it's not right after all. You kind of get, you lock yourself into something. It's an inflexibility to do.
Oh yeah, when you say it's sort of like never say never, and the other thing is to not be absolute about anything, because as soon as you are, then you have to back up and explain yourself why you've changed your mind a little bit, or there's evidence that goes another direction.
Yeah.
And I think one of the fascinating things that I found with your book was that island in the middle of the Nile, Elephantine, or that had Jewish temples and structures in it, and that's in the middle of the Nile in Egypt. So, and that documented way back too. So
yes. Well, actually, way back, but surprisingly late. It's about the same time that in the middle of the 5th century BC, that Jerusalem is standardizing the religion and codifying it. At the same time, there's this community actually of Hebrew mercenaries. Israelites and Jews were actually very praised for their fighting skills in the ancient world. There's this community of mercenaries on this island in the Nile. They have their own temple. None of this was known until it's all come up within the last 100 and really the last 50 years from archaeological discoveries, because there's nothing in the written historical record about this community and this temple at all. It's only when they actually excavated it and found many texts there to do with this community generally, not just the religion. But they had this temple to Yahweh, but also in that temple, he worshipped alongside him, was a goddess, actually not Asherah this time, but Anat, the war goddess that we mentioned earlier, which obviously makes sense for a community of mercenaries. Now, the assumption has always been that this community, as it had been in Egypt and cut off from the rest of I was going to say the Jews, it could be Samaritans as well, you see. That's why we always prefer the term Hebrew, really just to be more precise, because it could come from, say, the Samaritan line. And, no one's really sure about this. But the assumption was that because they'd been cut off, they had adopted pagan ways from the Egyptians they were living among. And to be honest, when we wrote the Templar Revelation, over 20 years ago, that's what we assumed as well. It's only from the research that we've done for this new book that we've actually realized, for reasons that we go into in the book, that actually that community had been there a very long time, and it actually preserved, they hadn't added a goddess in, they preserved the original form of the Israelite religion, that the goddess had been taken out of the official version in Jerusalem and the temple. So this community actually kept to a much earlier form, in which the goddess paired with Yahweh actually wasn't Asherah at that point. It was Anat, say the war goddess, who does feature in between the lines of the Hebrew Bible. She's there, and our reconstruction of that, and one has to speculate because there really isn't a lot of evidence left, is that in the earliest times when the Israelites were kind of permanently at war with the people around them, Canaanites, Philistines, before the kingdom was established, that Yahweh, who was a very kind of warlike God, he's always kind of telling them to go and massacre other peoples, go and invade this land and kill everybody in it. That his consort at that time was actually Anat, the war goddess, who was this very, very bloodthirsty, very scary, actually also very sexual, lustful goddess. That was Yahweh's original consort. Later, when the kingdom was established and everything settled down and things were a bit more peaceful, they realized that Anat wasn't a great role model for the daughters of the people of Israel. And they actually kind of smoothed over, and what had been El's wife, Asherah, was sort of given over to Yahweh instead, which is something that happened in the ancient world a lot. They were very fluid about god forms and goddess forms, and even linking changing a mother to a daughter at some point, which happened. There's other parallels with that, So there's this community that, and this is down to around about the year 400, is still retaining that original form of the religion because of things that happened when Alexander the Great invaded Egypt. And things changed around. That community was moved, and has nobody knows what happened to it. That whole community in Elephantine Island, which comprised, there was Egyptians there too. It was a garrison town. They were all moved out, and we don't know what happened to that community once it had moved on. But it's about 400 BC, still worshipping a goddess alongside Yahweh. That community moved on somewhere, and they wouldn't have changed their beliefs, No. So
the goddess wouldn't have gone quietly. No. Not that goddess, anyway.
No.
No.
So and this, he's always closing the gap to Jesus' own time. Again, when we wrote Templar Revelation, again, it was 1997 that first came out. And advanced this idea that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were trying to bring the goddess back into the Jewish religion. We kind of assumed that she had been airbrushed out a long, long way back. But the more we looked at it, the more the gap closed until it's only a few generations before Jesus that it's disappears from the historical record. And of course, beliefs don't disappear.
No, it would have continued underground.
Keep them alive. So it just became more and more plausible that in Samaria and probably in Egypt, there were still people that remembered that original religion and wanted it back.
Well, I think today we are all striving for that too, and I think the wonderful part of it is that for a great many people, they are not so indoctrinated by a quote-unquote religion that they aren't comfortable with recognizing the fact that there is Mother Nature, that there is the element. I mean, I know a lot of people who, when they pray, go Father, Mother, God, so that there is that element of it's coming back into our consciousnesses even more so than in daily life. I mean, if you look at Washington, D.C., at the top of many of the public buildings, there are goddesses. I mean, she's never been absent. She's just not been in the forefront. And I do believe that with many people today, there is that acknowledgement that there is a duality even within each individual, so that she's still making her presence known, although not as blatantly as once she did. But there is that element of understanding that part of ourselves has to be whole and balanced in order for our society to be. I mean, politically speaking, forget it. But even as far as religions go, they're going to be so far behind that it's in another 1,000 years that I don't even know that there will be major religions. But it just seems to me that it's such a precious part of our history, both all religions, not just the two major ones, but all religions, the Indian religions too. I mean, you've got Shiva, you've got all of those Indian goddesses that have been a profound balance to a male aspect within their religion. It's there. And I think that we are free enough in our thinking, if you choose to think, that it would make sense that there would be a balance. And I'm hopeful that your book will help wake up a lot of people to the fact that she's always been there, she always is, and she always will be, just as all of the rest of it is.
Yeah, I mean that's why we wrote the book. Really, is to make this point. As I said earlier, to provide some facts.
Yes.
So it's to back up the feeling and the intuition that so many people have. But yes, it is, again, it was the fall and rise, and she is rising again.
She is. Actually, the saddest part, though, to me, has always been this whole story and our journey, if you like, is knowing that the last people to hear any of the good stuff, in any of the stuff about the goddess or the balance or anything, are the average worshippers, the average synagogue or churchgoers. They'll be the last people to hear anything about it, because we're looking at traditions that have been jealously guarded and still will be.
Yes, but the foundations aren't there. I think that's what's so great about your book. You have documented and you have given the kind of proof that anybody can check out. It's not you two deciding to create your own new cult. It's that this stuff has always been there. And I mean, my gosh, your footnotes and your references are they'll chuck a horse. I finally quit because it's there. And as new documentation comes up, as they release it took them how long to release the Dead Sea Scrolls? 10 years, a decade or so?
Oh, much longer with the Dead Sea Scroll. They discovered in 1945.
I think
47. Sorry. I mean, they weren't really publicly in translation until the 1990s.
No. Yeah.
Because of this, people were scared scared what they would find in them. Yeah. I mean, there's a whole thing of saying, well, it was the Vatican that took control of the academic side of that, and what could be disseminated even amongst professors and experts, are very much controlled by the Vatican. And it's always been said that it's because they knew what was in there and they wanted to stop it getting out. I think it's more that they didn't know what was in there, but were terrified about what it might be. Yeah. Because they know that there is such a. I was going to say their church is built in such a rocky foundation. There's probably a joke in there somewhere.
Yeah, probably.
But it was. And that's why they tried to control things like that, the Dead Sea Scrolls. But in the end, they can't. It gets out.
Now, one of the cool things about being human is that we actually have free will, and most people don't recognize it. But and Jesus did say someplace in the Bible, I can't quote you chapter and verse, but he said, "Question everything."
Yeah.
And so it's up to the individual to question. And you with this book have put an amazing amount of fact into it all. And you connected your dots and it makes good sense. But given the facts that you put out there, sometimes seeds of wisdom take a great deal of time to actually germinate and to flower. But that's the wonderful part about podcasts and things like this, that you put the information out there, and when people are ready to hear it, they'll listen. And when people are ready, I mean, books are kind of almost a thing of the past, but you've got the electronic books and stuff like that too. Your book is fabulous, and I want to remind people that they can check out your website at PicknettPrince, that's PicknettPrince.com, and the book is available, or will be available, tomorrow on Amazon. So if you want a challenging read, if you want something that is going to perk your interest so that you dig out whole bunches of other books, and Sacred Sites is a good site for people to look at too. It's sacredsites.com. A lot of old books and texts and everything are there, and they're free. It's free to read online, so you don't have to buy anything or join anything. But do check out some of these references, because they're phenomenal. Some of the texts that didn't make it into the Bible, unbelievable stuff. So that it's an exciting journey you can take into the source and the creation of what is here today, and the possibility of what can come beyond if everybody takes the time to educate themselves. I mean, it's don't question. Don't take somebody's word for something. Don't swallow dogma totally. Allow yourself to grow and understand, and then internally create your own spiritual truths that you're going to live by. Because if you do it that way, then you can't be wrong. You just can't be. You can change your mind, of course, but you can't be wrong. Whatever you say is your truth for that moment. And as I have often said, my philosophy will change tomorrow, so check back in then. But we're right close to the end of the show. I want to thank you guys so much. This has been so much fun, and so much educational stuff and insightful stuff that I.
Thank you, Barbara. It's been a great discussion.
It's been fabulous. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to now sit back and read all your other books and have you back on all of those.
Oh, please do. We'll be delighted. Absolutely.
Is there any new? I know the book comes out tomorrow. Is there any other new information you want to get out there before they shut us down?
Well, no. The book is out. It will be out. And as an ebook as well. You can order it through. There are Amazon links through our website.
Uh-huh.
If you do it that way, we get a cut.
Yeah, please do. Please do.
But yes, and we're just going to be fascinated to see what the reaction is, see what response we get from people. So yeah, we're just looking forward to what happens next.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So out of curiosity, what are you now working on?
Well, actually, as usual, we've got a few ideas going on, and we just want to see which is the one that hits. We're just kind of letting things gestate, and we're going to see which one suddenly seems to be the right thing. We're also trying to do a lot more work on television now. So, there's just plenty going on at the moment. But whatever we do next, we shall let you know.
Yep.
Please do, and thank you so much for first of all doing the intense amount of research that went into this book, and then putting it in an absolute readable format, so that anybody, you don't have to have a historical or a biblical background to be able to understand where they're going, and absolutely check out their footnotes. You'll get frustrated because they're all there, but check them out.
You need access to a really good library for a lot more.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah.
Don't take anybody's word for anything, including ours.
Yes,
absolutely.
Yeah.
But one of the things we do just very quickly was to kind of pull together information that's been around for a while, but it's been buried in academic publications and journals and books, and symposiums and things that just haven't got out to a mainstream audience. And one of the things we want to do is pull that all together and put it in a place where people will get to it.
Absolutely. Well, we're right down to the very end here. I want to thank you and Mark. Thank you for being the bridge between countries here, and also encourage everybody to check the book out. It is fabulous. Mark has a great show tomorrow, and back on next Monday with Scott Walter for his new book. But do check out the website and check out the YouTube channel, and if you are intrigued, hopefully you'll subscribe. Be that, it's I'm right down to the last 10 seconds. Thank you so much, everybody. I so enjoyed this, and thank you everybody for listening. Please check out this book. It's a great one. Good night now.